Welcome everyone to the OurCrowd webinar about AI to the rescue, how artificial intelligence is reinventing the hospital. I'm John Medved and I'm your host today. I am the CEO and founder of OurCrowd, and I'm being joined by a really distinguished group of guests, panelists, and speakers who represent the best of startups innovating in this area, hospital professionals and leaders, investors, as well as guest experts. And we have a really very fully packed session, which we'll, of course, as usual, give you the chance to ask questions at the end. Just a few opening comments. One cannot overestimate the importance of artificial intelligence. We've all heard about it, how it's going to, God forbid, threaten some people's jobs, going to change our lives, going to make robots ubiquitous. But the reality is that artificial intelligence is very, very big. And thank God, because it turns out that here in Israel, we are a world power in artificial intelligence. Right now, the third most prolific country in the world in terms of AI startups, just behind the United States and China. It also turns out that Israel's very strong in digital health and in general in terms of healthcare innovation. Now, when you combine artificial intelligence together with digital health, you get a perfect storm. And it turns out that artificial intelligence is now being used in countless startups, both in Israel, the world, and in particular in the OurCrowd portfolio. You're going to hear real live examples today about how this AI is really changing things in a very fundamental way that should, first of all, make us all healthier, but secondly, actually produce great returns for investors. So to get us kicked off, we're going to turn to Dr. Morris Laster. Dr. Laster is the head of the OurCrowd medical investment team. He is responsible for, I think it's 6 different IPOs in New York. He is a prolific inventor and researcher and my friend, and I'm turning it over to you. Morris, take it away.
Thank you very much for that, John. Pleased to be here as a managing partner of the Pandemic Innovation Fund that we've recently launched. So what you see really is a convergence of the digital applications and artificial intelligence really coming to bear in changing how we do medical startups. And then we ask, why do a pandemic innovation fund? Well, the frequency of pandemics is rising due to globalization, our interconnectedness, our encroaching on untouched environments that are exposing us to virus and pathogens that we've never seen before. The human and economic costs, obviously, we have been seen through the current COVID crisis, has been incredible. Preventing and controlling these pandemics are going to require a large range of innovations, and they'll generate tremendous returns. We essentially view the Pandemic Innovation Fund as a private pandemic play. When you look at companies like Zoom or J&J or many of the other medical technologies that have come to bear in helping to get us through this current pandemic. Pandemics and epidemics are increasing. You see, over the past 16, 17 years, there have been 5 different epidemics. The Ebola virus one is missing from this chart. But you see SARS, swine flu, MERS, Ebola in 2014-15, and the current COVID-19 crisis. When we set up the fund, we set up 3 different silos of investments. We're looking at prevention and containment, whether they be early sensors and detection, vaccines, data modeling, personal protective equipment, treatment and healing in terms of direct effects on the virus. But we've seen that this virus has tremendous impact on many other diseases. It's been shown to cause type 1 and type 2 diabetes, as well as worsening of diabetes. Patients who recover suffer from neurological deficits. There's an increase in stroke and kidney disease. This disease is not just a pneumonia. It's not just a lung disease. It is so much more than that. And we're looking at various diagnostics, medical equipment, robotics, telehealth, And what we see is just this tremendous convergence of artificial intelligence and AI and digital health coming to bear to treat all of these various conditions. We also have a silo dealing with the new normal. That is how we live our lives. And that's going to be an important part of the investment thesis as well. When we look at prevention and containment, we have companies like Medved developing a novel oral subunit vaccine against COVID-19 based on the work being done at Migal Research Institute up north. MeMed, which can diagnose with a small pinprick of blood the differential between bacterial and viral infections, in addition to potentially picking out which patients who have COVID-19 are going to deteriorate. Visible Zone, more efficient tracking and tracing software. If we look at treatment and healing, we invested in a company called Sanitize, which is developing a liquid nitric oxide spray to prevent and potentially treat COVID-19. It's currently in clinical trials. Diagnostics, which you'll hear more about later, preventing infected blood samples from traveling all around the hospital from the COVID wards. Untitled Care, which enables patients to essentially perform their own physical exams without requiring physicians to expose themselves. Post-COVID-19, actually, while COVID-19 is going on, we're seeing a tremendous explosion of telemedicine, remote monitoring, and digital therapeutics, and tools for decision support and drug discovery, which you'll hear about again later with Cytoreason. COVID-19 is driving digital health application, this tremendous uptick in March 20 on the right-hand part of the slide. And this is probably the most important aspect for funding and for investments. The FDA has been very flexible to grant approved market access to diagnostics and therapeutics, but here's where it really happens. Payment and reimbursement has been happening for telehealth and remote patient monitoring, which had not happened prior to this pandemic. We're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle. People have discovered the ease and efficiency of seeing their healthcare professionals via telehealth, remote patient monitoring, and the various technologies that are being brought to bear currently. Deal sizes are increasing in the digital health area. We're looking at the subsector investments, which really track with what we believe to be the COVID-19 impact post-pandemic. And there have been billion-dollar exits. I think the most notable one you see, Livongo going public for $2.5 billion, but yet being merged with Teladoc for $18 billion. So we're looking at a tremendous opportunity, both in terms of making our lives better, and in addition to which we can find incredible investments in the fields of digital health and artificial intelligence in this current pandemic crisis.
Thank you, Morris. That was great. And we're moving on now to Dr. Eyal Zimlichman. Dr. Zimlichman is the Deputy Director of Sheba Hospital. He is also the Chief Medical Officer and their Chief of Innovation. Now, for those of you who don't know, Sheba is Israel's largest hospital. And in fact, in just last year, Newsweek named Sheba the only hospital from Israel in its list of the top 10 hospitals in the world. Before in his career, Dr. Zimlichman was also at Partners. He's got a great academic background, and we're delighted to have him today speak about the utilization that Sheba is placing on AI in its activities. Dr. Zimlichman, please.
Thank you, John, and thank you for having me. Happy to talk about our experience at Sheba, specifically during COVID and specifically with AI, of course. A few words before we dive into this. Our innovation program at Sheba is quite unique. We have an innovation program we call ARC, A-R-C, which stands for Accelerate, Redesign, and Collaborate. Accelerate innovation to redesign healthcare by collaborating with partners, where the idea is to come up with the vision of what healthcare needs to look like in the future, and we're targeting the year 2030 as the future we're looking towards, and then see how can we impact that vision, how can we make that vision a reality using innovation. Some of the innovation is innovation coming from leading startup companies, And some of the innovative solutions are coming internally from the hospital. And to do that, we've created an ecosystem of partners across the world that include academic medical centers and leading industry partners really from around the world. So it's really about an ecosystem that works together, and we've been utilizing and putting ARC to the test during the time of COVID. Now, I call it, again, the perfect storm. We've worked on building ARC in the past 4 years, and then finally hitting COVID, which of course we never expected, created that perfect storm and putting ARC to the test in terms of what can it do on innovation. And during a very short while, we came up with a large number of innovative solutions. Some of them, again, internally developed, but others is technologies that we've taken from vendors outside, startup companies, again, that weren't built for COVID solutions, but putting them to the test to work on COVID. And I'll be happy to share some of those examples.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the examples, Dr. Zimlichman, is, of course, the well-known company Cytocare, which also happens to be an OurCrowd investment. Cytocare is used for telemedicine, and my understanding is you put it to very good use during the crisis. Can you explain?
Of course. It's a perfect example of using a technology for something a bit different than what it was originally designed for. Cytocare has been designed to for telemedicine purposes, to have doctors able to examine patients who are at their home. And of course, nobody thought about using Cytocare inside the hospital. That wasn't the use. Nobody thought that we would have a problem with doctors standing next to patients and examining them with a stethoscope at the bedside like it was traditionally done. But here, during this COVID crisis, we came to a problem, and where we wanted to have minimal contact between our staff and the patients with the virus so that we can minimize exposure to the staff. We've seen cases in China, in Italy, and some other locations, of course, in Europe and the US, where staff members contracted the virus and even died. And so we wanted to minimize that, of course, as much as possible. And this is where we thought to utilize Cytocare. So we ended up using Cytocare inside the hospitals, where the doctors were sitting in a room next to the room where the patient was, using Cytocare to examine the patients, listen to the heart, listen to the lungs, look down the throat and into an ear, and perform the full physical examination almost just like you do on daily rounds when patients are hospitalized. So first time that we actually use the technology intended to use outside of the hospital, inside the hospital. What happened with that is a huge, it's a huge story, because we've seen clinicians that traditionally were resistant to using this type of technology. They were saying, I don't need some fancy technology to examine a patient. I need my stethoscope and my hands like I've been using all along. But once they tried working with Cytocare, they saw that they got great results. They could make great diagnosis and great treatment decisions. And right now we've got them hooked. So post-COVID, as we're going back to treating patients at home, which of course is the aim, we have now a full staff that is bought into the technology and is looking for the opportunity to use Cytocare for the other purposes.
It's really remarkable the degree to which telemedicine is going to change the hospital experience. I mean, we had the head of Johns Hopkins Health on our pandemic innovation conference online, and he suggested that 30% of hospital visits in the near future will move to telemedicine. Do you think that's true?
I agree. It depends what do you call the near future. We're predicting that in 10 years we'll see 70%.
Wow.
70%, not just the hospital visits, but also hospitalizations. We're going to see hospitalizations at home. We're building a hospital at home model that is based on technology. We're using about 5 different startup companies in our hospital at home model, which is the only kind in the world, because hospital at home is around, but not using technology, having the doctor and the nurse coming over to the patient's house to treat the patient. We're doing all that through telemedicine, like we're doing the rounds on COVID patients inside the hospital using telemedicine. Why not extend that to the home?
Now, one of the hospital at home, I think, companies is probably our guest here later on in this webinar, Diagnostics. My understanding is you were using their point of care blood test and even looking at being able to do chemo in people's homes and not necessarily force them to come to the hospital. How does that work?
Well, point of care is obviously critical as we move to the home, and we're going to need ways to examine and do blood tests on patients at home that they're not in the hospital. Even within the hospital, point of care is critical. If you want to have patients' blood tests taken at the emergency department or in the intensive care unit or the chemotherapy suites without having to send your lab test to the lab. And Diagnostic, of course, is a sort of a new age in blood tests. Being able to do this, first of all, much more cheaper than the current technology is doing it. And second of all, at the point of care where the blood tests and the results are needed most. We're even thinking with Cyt to diagnose COVID using the same technology and artificial intelligence built on imaging of the blood, looking at the blood smear of the blood cells rather than going through the typical technology we're using, the huge machines we have in laboratories today.
So finally, I mean, one of the other titles you carry is you were the head of quality at the hospital as well. And another one of our companies actually was born at Sheba, and that's a company called Medware, who basically use AI to make sure that you guys don't make mistakes when you're treating patients in terms of prescriptions. Do you believe that this kind of AI can save lives and can prevent mistakes from being made?
Well, for sure, we're seeing it happen. We've already published several publications together with our partners in Boston and here at Sheba, showing proof, evidence that we're actually saving lives and preventing mistakes. The ability of artificial intelligence to learn and to react to how doctors are reacting, basically. The current solutions that every hospital almost has today are looking at rule-based approach, saying, if the dosage is above a certain threshold, let's hit the alert button. The problem with that is we get too many alerts, and that causes alert fatigue. With AI, we get more accurate alerts. So, for example, as you mentioned, Medware, on Medware, the entire unit gets on average about 2 or 3 alerts a day. With the traditional systems, we get sometimes more than 100 a day. And of course, more than 100 creates that alert fatigue I was mentioning, where 2 or 3 really captures the clinician's attention. And that's the huge difference we're seeing with Medware.
Dr. Zimlichman, I wish we had more time. This is fascinating. We'll have you back. And really, kol hakavod on what you're doing at Sheba, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. Next up is going to be Oren Sarig, who is the head of business strategy at Diagnostic Robotics, which is another leading AI company. Oren has a background academically at Yale University. He also was a senior member of one of Israel's storied intelligence units, 8200. He did some work on Medicare, and he's charting the business strategy for literally one of Israel's most exciting companies, Diagnostic Robotics, and he'll introduce us to the company. Oren?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Let me start by introducing the company ourselves. Diagnostic Robotics was founded by Dr. Kira Rudinsky, most recently the chief scientist in Israel of eBay, by Professor Moshe Shoham, the founder of Mazor Robotics, acquired by Medtronic, and our CEO, Jonathan Amir. Our medical board includes John Halamka, the president of platforms at Mayo Clinic, Nathan Shapiro of Harvard and Beth Israel, and Daniel Kraft of Singularity University. We're a group of professionals passionate about thinking how AI can help reimagine the way patients access healthcare. Diagnostic Robotics started out as a company developing a triage solution for emergency departments. We developed a system that asks a patient a set of clinical questions about their medical complaint and makes predictions about the most likely course of treatment to help emergency departments optimize their operations. The AI algorithms are based on a very large data set of tens of millions of medical records and tens of billions of claims records obtained through strategic partnerships both in Israel and the United States. We use cutting-edge machine learning technology, including deep learning, neural networks, natural language processing techniques, to come up with accurate predictions about clinical outcomes. Using those predictions, Diagnostic Robotics has moved to developing a full suite of AI solutions that helps reimagine the way patients access care from home. We incorporate the clinical engines in a number of points of the patient clinical journey. We help patients make decisions about where to seek medical care. We help make the intake process for providers more efficient. And we help health systems reach out to patients that should be seeking medical care but are not doing so of their own accord. As a company, our strategy has been to work with health systems to integrate the clinical engine within existing health journeys of patients at a number of points along the patient journey where we can help optimize their treatment path. We developed our solutions in partnerships with a number of large organizations, including Mayo Clinic, the #1 ranked hospital in the US, with Anthem, the second largest health insurance plan in the US, and with strategic partnerships, for example, with the state of Rhode Island, as can be seen here on this slide. Over the past 3 months, we've had over 2 million patients triaged through our systems through the variety of entry points we offer. Today, I want to talk about one such entry point where we incorporate our clinical engine that helps patients make a decision about the right type of provider to treat their medical complaint. As is well known, many medical complaints can be treated in a number of different settings, which come along with different associated costs. For example, a patient may have a headache and may seek treatment in an emergency department or at an urgent care center, PCP office, or so forth. And the cost decreases with the acuity of the provider with the patient seeks care. Similarly, a patient can seek care with a specialist physician or a PCP physician. Navigating patients to the most appropriate type of provider has a potential to generate substantial savings for health plan that are liable for the medical outlays for these patients. What Diagnostic Robotics offers is applying our system to help patients make a decision about where to seek care. We ask a patient a series of questions. We make predictions about the most likely type of medical care that patient will need. We combine these predictions with information from the client organization, the payer organization, about which providers they would like to see treating each medical condition. And using the combined assessments, we give a patient a recommendation about the most appropriate place where to seek care for their medical condition. For example, one place where this can be integrated in workflows is when provider directories. Many payer organizations offer their patients a directory on the website that helps a patient find a provider that provides medical care that works with their health plan. We integrate with those provider directories. And for example, a patient with a rash that might go online for a directory to seek a dermatologist to treat their rash will go on that website, look for a dermatologist. We can interject that flow, ask the patient a few questions about their complaint, and make an assessment about whether a PCP might be a more suitable treatment location for their complaint. If so, we might refer them to a PCP to seek treatment there. And by doing so, we can generate savings for the health plan. Our system covers most of the common complaints made by patients to their physicians and can generate substantial savings for health systems incorporating this tool into their workflows by diverting some of the care from specialist physicians to primary care practitioners. This is one example of where we integrate the clinical engine within existing health plan workflows. And as an approach, we've tried to integrate this in a number of points, including in advising about where to seek care and helping make the intake process more efficient and proactively reaching out to patients.
Thank you very much, Oren. Before I let you go, though, I want to ask you one quick question, and that is, clearly having this capability to do AI-assisted triage is going to cut waiting time and be more efficient in terms of throughput at the hospital, and I would dare say probably dramatically cut costs. But are people going to get a better quality of care?
Definitely. When you think about the outcomes of such systems, we usually think about both the cost component, we think about the quality of care component, we think about the patient satisfaction angle. You want to make sure you're making good progress on all three, which is why we focus on getting patients to the most appropriate site of care. So not only to the lowest cost site of care, but the one that's appropriate for their specific clinical condition. and to guarantee that they get the right quality of care, and also to increase patient satisfaction. For example, talking about the example I just showed, a PCP typically has shorter wait times as opposed to a specialist, and a telemedicine session is almost instant. So you can get patients to care immediately. You can both improve their satisfaction from the process, potentially get them to treatment faster, and make sure they meet the right kind of provider for their specific medical complaint. So that's the usual triple aim.
It sounds like a win-win-win, a trifecta from where I come from. Thank you, Oren. Next up is David Harel, who is the co-founder and CEO of Cytoreason. David has a rich background actually in private equity, my side of the fence, okay, where he helped many companies with finance, founded or co-founded Cytoreason in 2016. He's got a great academic background from the University of Haifa and the famous Carnegie Mellon, where he's got his MBA. David, take us into the world of Cytoreason and how you are accelerating drug discovery and therapeutics by using AI and incredible data sets.
Thank you very much, John. Today, I think a good place to start with integration of AI into drug development and pharma is probably start with the most interesting component that we have in front of us, and that's where are the COVID-19 vaccines and where are the phase 3 trials? And if we look at a couple of the trials that we have today, Moderna is looking for 30,000 volunteers. Pfizer and their BioNTech collaboration looking for 30,000 volunteers. Johnson & Johnson just announced that they're looking for 60,000 volunteers just to test the COVID-19 vaccines. These are phase 3 trials, and as you can expect, recruiting so many volunteers is both extremely expensive and lengthy in time. In reality, the numbers being thrown around that drug development and vaccines are notorious to be part of that are to the extent of $1 billion, $1.5 billion, $2 billion. But the main issue is that when we think about phase 3 trials, 55% of them fail on efficacy. That basically suggests that 55% of the phase 3 trials that cost hundreds of millions of dollars at the easiest outcome basically don't improve the patient outcome. And if we think about the combination of extremely expensive processes and such low probability of success, what we see over the past 50 years is what we call Eroom's law, which is the reverse of Moore's law. The cost of developing new drugs is increasing all the time over the past 60 years or 70 years. And as we can see, this is irrespective of regulatory and technology improvements. So when we think about where we are today, of the top 10 diseases are killing 15 million people every year. Healthcare costs in the US obviously are exceeding the $8 trillion a year. And despite the use advantage, the advances in science, basically, as we said, more than half of the phase 3 trial failed. So when we think about how drugs are being developed, obviously we have great news for the mice in the audience, right? We cured cancer and all autoimmune diseases. The problem is that curing humans is not as easy. And if we think about the process of developing a drug, this is the best practice today. We start with academic research, we try it on cell lines and organoids, and then basically the mice come in, we try cure a mouse, and if we can cure a mouse, basically there is a drug that is being formulated, and clinical trials start, and only in the clinical trials, human data is being collected. So the key issue with testing the drugs on mice is basically They're very cute, but they're ineffective. They're not a good replication of a human, not men, not women, and not a child. So let's talk for a second about where this might go. So if this is the best practice that we see today, what do we think might be the biology of the future? How would biology would be researched in the future? And basically, as we can expect, the data that is being collected is going to be streamlined and used in the drug development process. There are only two problems here. From a time perspective, the data is collected after the trial was started, not before. And if we think about, in general, where the data is going to come from, it needs to come from data across all the different industry and all the different trials, and that's basically what Cytoreason is doing. So Cytoreason, we're located in Tel Aviv, and we are partnering with most of the largest pharma companies. Basically, we are developing disease models, so replacing the mouse with a computational model that is based on the data of the different pharma companies. So the pharma companies keep their data in silos, and they're sharing it with us to build more sophisticated data models. And these models are basically, in turn, used by the pharmaceutical companies in order to replace the mouse to the extent possible and enhance the accuracy of the trials. When we think about the 21st century, it makes no sense that a trial that might cost billions, as we said earlier, would be analyzed standalone without the perspective of every other trial that was done. When we think about the Cytoreason models, basically we are integrating three key capabilities. One is the data that has been collected in the clinical trials. The second is the knowledge. So all the literature is analyzed by computer using natural language processing and other AI technologies. And basically we use machine learning to improve the model with every new trial that we see. Our models are being used by most of the large pharmaceutical companies, and specifically for COVID, we were the first company to publish commercially available off-the-shelf model of ARDS, which is the respiratory syndrome that is causing many of the deaths in the disease. So where we think that the industry is going, where would AI take the pharma? It's basically going to send quite a few mice to vacation, and we would be focusing on learning from humans to cure humans rather than trying to cure mice in order to improve patient outcomes.
Thank you very much, David. Before I let you go, I also want to ask you a quick question. This really is sort of in the middle of several, huge trends. The advances in computational biology, the fact that people are now collaborating cross countries and cross companies, and the need for speed in this whole process. Now, my understanding is that your system is consistently learning and getting better. How much better can this get? I mean, today the average drug takes about 2 decades to be produced. Is that correct in terms of gestation? Are we going to get in a decade or so with tools like Cytoreason down to a year or 2 years for drug development with these tools? How good does it get ultimately?
So let's talk about the purpose of getting better for a second. The goal that we all have is to treat very specific patient population and create drug in what's typically historically been called precision medicine or personalized medicine, to get drugs to the very, very specific small group of people. But the problem is, I showed before, that the costs are going up all the time and probability of success goes down. So until you change and you make drug development cheaper, you will not be able to create drugs for smaller and smaller groups of people and create better treatment for the patients. And that's the main clinical challenge here. Basically, we believe that getting better drugs and getting faster development is crucially dependent on the ability to integrate the data. I'll give you a quick anecdote. If you're trying to develop a new e-commerce engine, or you're trying to calculate, or you're trying to understand how transactions happen online, you might rely on Amazon's data sets. They probably have 30-40% of the e-commerce transactions available. If we're thinking about what we have in clinical trials, probably J&J is the largest single owner of data trial, but they own only 3% of what's out there. So we believe that by breaking those silos, integrating everything, we would be able to speed up development and increase the accuracy much, much better. And the results show that this can make big difference. And as I said earlier, the difference would be by reducing the cost. It would allow the pharmaceutical companies to bring drugs for smaller groups of people and improve and accurate and get the treatment more precise.
This is wonderful. Thank you very much, David. And now we're going to go to a sort of little round table. I'm going to be joined by my good friend Ellie Groner, who's the managing director of Koch Disruptive Technologies. The Koch brothers are legendary investors running one of the world's largest corporations, have got a very, very dynamic new investment vehicle called Koch Disruptive, and Ellie is managing director here in Israel and has been very active. I think you've made now 4 investments. We're also joined by Daniel Levner, who is the head of science. I think is the title carrying. He's a co-founder of Cyte, but he is right now very, very active in terms of running the Cyte business. And his background is that he completed his education at UT and actually studied aeronautics and astronautics at Stanford, got his PhD at Stanford in EE, and then was trained in Dr. George Church's world-renowned genetics lab, and now is working at Cyte. So we're going to talk about Cyte Diagnostics just to set the stage. Just recently, there was a $71 million investment round at Cyte that Koch participated in, along with OurCrowd and others. Koch led, actually, with the largest check. And Cyte is under a lot of momentum right at this moment. And I'd love to ask Ellie to get us started. What excited you initially about Cyte? Why did you decide to move forward and lead this investment?
You mentioned in the introduction, John, that there was reluctance at the outset of AI. Wait, is this going to replace people? Is this going to replace physicians? And I think Eyal mentioned that as well in the context of title care. Wait, what does this mean for physicians? But I think everyone recognizes now, both in the medical communities and in the AI communities, that if AI is to revolutionize healthcare, and it will revolutionize healthcare, then it's going to be with the assisted model. You're going to see AI-assisted pathology, AI-assisted radiology. It's going to be a collaborative model where you don't replace the practitioner, you don't replace the physician, you actually work in tandem with them. And that's the first thing that sort of excited me significantly about Cyte Diagnostics. And then the second one is that if you think about how AI is going to revolutionize healthcare, the first wave will be in areas of computer vision. I think it's very clear because AI there basically surpasses any human performance, especially in sort of diagnostic areas. And so if you take those two powerful tailwind effects, that drives right into, what the core of what Cyte Diagnostics is doing. And, the Cyte team is it's been a magnet for exceptionally talented people like Daniel and others that are there. So we're very excited by the team, and we're very excited for where they stand sort of at the crossroads of various tailwinds in the worlds of AI and medical technology.
So Ellie, look, you spent, I think it was 5 years as the Director General of our Prime Minister's office. It doesn't get more intense than that. You were, in many claim, the real power behind making this huge government move into supporting digital health. and you understand the role that people coming from Israel's military units play, especially, from some of these programs. Now, my understanding at Site is you've got how many people, Daniel, out of the Talpiot program? I understand that you guys have just hoovered these people up. They are, by the way, the most intelligent geniuses in the world, very multidisciplinary. But what makes Site so interesting, in my opinion, is the fact that they succeeded where this other company, whose name I even hate to mention, Theranos, failed miserably and was engaged in, it looks like, stretching the truth would be an understatement. Didn't that scare you a little bit, when you're going into an area like this? Or, how did you feel about, did people ask you, why are we doing this? This is an area that has, left wreckage in its past.
John, when you understand the approach that Site Diagnostics takes, they basically disrupted the entire flow cytometry approach, and they just use very advanced computer vision. And when you think about, wow, if they really are the best in the world at taking very small quantities of blood, right, 2 drops, and you're able to read that blood more effectively than anyone else, and you're able to take many high-resolution photographs of the blood in order to diagnose complete blood count and other applications that will be coming from having this great blood database, it becomes more understandable, right? As soon as, when you understand that it wasn't a new approach to biology or a new approach to chemistry or any other such stories, it was really about computer vision, which is really one of the areas that Israel is most distinctive in, alongside with this sort of very clean, appropriate approach. You can understand why we got excited about it. We became very, very convinced and remain very convinced that this actually works. And that's what gives us a lot of excitement.
So Daniel, I mean, my understanding is how many pictures does Site take actually of the blood with each test?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks John and Ellie for having me. What we do at Site is exactly as you described. We take a very large number of pictures from patient blood, specifically 2 drops of blood, so very little amount of blood. And we take over 1,000 pictures per sample. And
wait, 1,000 pictures, and how much data does that represent?
Yeah, so it's about 6 gigabytes of image data per patient.
My gosh, I mean, you must be funded by Seagate, I hope. Okay.
Not yet.
Storage.
Not yet. But our magic is that as we're taking the pictures, which is actually already part of the innovation, right? Pictures of blood don't just present themselves. You have to formulate the blood. You have to present it in a nice flat layer. You have to stain it in the right way so that the right features are highlighted. And once we do that, the images, just as they're taken in real time, as we call it, get processed by a computer that's built into our instrument. It's a small instrument. It's a desktop instrument. It's about 30 centimeters on the side, 1 foot on the side. And as they're taken, they're being analyzed using these AI algorithms. So the AI algorithm replaces what a person would do, which is look at it and say, look, this is a red blood cell, this is a white blood cell, specifically it's this kind of white blood cell, and counts them and adds them. And that's the basis for this test called the complete blood count, which, as it happens, is actually the world's most ordered blood test. There's over 4 billion of them ordered each year around the world.
4 billion tests, and the average cost is something like $20 or $25 a test. Is that correct?
Yeah, the prices vary around the world, somewhere between $10 for a reimbursement to higher than that, depending where it's actually done. It's a very high volume test. It's done very frequently, and that's one of the reasons we targeted it, and it's also why it fits into the hospital system. There's countless numbers of these complete blood counts performed every day in a hospital setting. And you can ask, well, why do you need a new instrument? Surely doctors already know how to do that today. And it's true, there's amazing instruments that can reside in one of these fancy, expensive central labs within the hospital. But there is a trend now for this kind of diagnostic testing to be decentralized. So one example, we talked about COVID a little earlier in this segment, and with COVID, you have isolation units, you have triage units, you have all these areas in a hospital that you don't really want to start shipping samples right to the central lab. You certainly don't want to start moving potentially sick patients all around the hospital. So the ability to decentralize, to take this kind of testing and position it closer to where it is that you want is very powerful. COVID is just one example. I think somebody earlier mentioned chemotherapy and cancer diagnostics and so on. There's many examples where we want to decentralize.
And your test takes a full 10 minutes. That's it. So
yeah, it's in the neighborhood of 10 minutes. Right, exactly.
When I did it, I've actually done the test and it worked. It basically blew my mind because, you know, when you go into the emergency room, you know that once they finally order the test, you know, you've got to wait for quite some time until the bloods come back. And if you're not at the hospital, but you're a doctor's office or the clinic, you're waiting a day or two.
You hit the nail on the head. The reason that testing today is slow is because you have to physically ship the blood tubes, right? You have to collect them, you have to bring them to the hospital, you have to put them on a conveyor belt, you have to prioritize them, and then run them through the instrument. The beauty of our system is that we talk about digitizing blood, right? Once you've done this scanning that I mentioned, you get the 6 gigabyte file of digital information, and it's digital at that point. You no longer have to ship the physical blood from site to site. Another place where this decentralization is important is that actually today hospitals are very rarely a single building. Very often now hospitals are networks and they have satellite facilities and so on. Today, with decentralized instruments, they have to physically collect the blood from all these different satellite facilities and then bring them back to the central location. Whereas by positioning our instruments in this decentralized fashion that I keep referring to, you avoid that problem.
So you've now got this data. Ellie, did that excite you, the notion that these guys are collecting, God willing, you know, millions upon millions of patient samples and developing know-how about what's going on in the blood that will lead not just to a potential C test, but something even greater in the future? Was that part of your calculus?
John, you've gotten to know Koch reasonably well over the last couple of years, and you can assume, it sounds like you're inferring that, you know, if this was just a CBC play, we would not have been excited about it. When we invest in companies, we look for companies with immense potential. And by building the most accurate, impressive digital blood database in the world, there are going to be many applications beyond just CBC tests. Now, again, you need to do things in step order and make sure that the CBC tests get out there, et cetera. But this blood database eventually is going to be able to give predictive sort of diagnostics around blood diseases. There's going to be implications for animal health. And by the way, the computer vision approach to diagnostics, it could actually eventually replace the flow cytometry driven processes in the lab. So I don't think you're actually going to ever eliminate everything from the labs, but I do think that you're going to be able to make the process in the central labs more efficient as well using this technology developed by Site Diagnostics. So we're very excited about this beyond just the CBC play.
Daniel, if I had to ask you one final question about what is your greatest hope long term that you guys will achieve, haven't got around to doing yet, but your favorite sort of pet project for the distant, not so distant future. What is that?
You know, I think Eyal alluded to it quite nicely. CBC is just a beginning for us. And actually before CBC, we also developed a malaria test that's now present in 25 different countries around the world. This idea of decentralizing testing, this idea of having this rapid turnaround, right? The days of wait time that we experience today, eliminating that and having your answers available right there in your visit, that's a big dream, right? It shouldn't just be limited to CBC. Really, eventually, all of the tests should be done, or at least a large majority of them should be done right there quickly. And we are committed to really pushing on that vision. That is a vision that drives our company.
So I think, thank you very much, Daniel and Ellie, for sharing with us the excitement at Site Diagnostics. We are very proud that we were one of the first investors here over 6 years ago, and the best is yet to come. A lot of good things have happened so far, but hold on, it's going to be great. Look, we've now talked about several amazing companies in the areas of diagnostics and testing, drug discovery and data sets, triage. We have this absolutely wonderful innovation center at Sheba where so many of our companies are working, changing the way the hospitals are run. I think this gives you, in a relatively short period of time, a good little capsule of what's going on in the Israeli ecosystem, especially around AI and around digital health. We'd like to now turn to you for your questions, because we really want to know what you're thinking and what you're interested in relative to AI and how it's going to reinvent the hospital. Please write your questions to us on the Q&A feature of the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll look for those Q&A questions. Some of them have already come in, and we look forward to answering them and giving the panelists a chance to interact with you. Someone's asking about how much AI gets better across the period of time over the next decade, right? Many of you referred to machine learning and the fact that your systems will get better because they'll collect more data. But the trick is, what about the actual AI technology? Is this only simply about data, or are there going to be breakthroughs in AI that will allow you and your companies to do things differently and more efficiently going forward? Anybody want to take that?
I can take that if you'd like, John.
Go ahead, Ellie.
So AI right now is fundamentally constrained by processing capacity, right? So the chips out there in the world, the CPUs, the GPUs, they can't begin to process AI. The models are just too heavy. And that obviously constrains what you're able to do, because you're not going to see all these medical technology devices and even the hospitals investing tens of millions, hundreds of millions in order to increase their processing power just to supplement the diagnostics and the treatments they're providing today. Therefore, what we're going to need to see in the world of AI is we're actually going to see something which isn't directly related to medical care. It's about enabling AI to process more effectively, more efficiently, so that you can bring AI to edge devices. So all of a sudden, you'll be able to really apply AI much more broadly than you can today. And that's going to have implications for health technology as well.
Happy to also give an answer. Just another angle here is to make AI algorithms effective. It's also a lot about bringing in distinct data sources, so different types of data. At least working in a US context, you can see that the data is often spread out among different systems. So the lab data is in one place and the claims data in the other, and then the EMR data in another place. And one thing that's really exciting that's happening in the ecosystem is you see all those pipelines being built that enable creating models that are based on multiple types of data with additional kinds of external data sources, including sensors coming in. And those really matter meaningfully in being able to get precise AI predictions for medical outcomes as well.
Thank you. One of the questions that has been asked, and I think it's very, very pointed relative to what Dr. Zimlichman talked about before, where as much as 70% of procedures might go on, in a telemedicine realm rather than in the hospital itself. What is that? Now, that's obviously going to reduce costs and make healthcare more effective. But what is that going to do to the hospital in terms of the business model? My understanding is that during the recent COVID crisis, many of the hospitals were suffering because people weren't going to the hospital and spending money. Now, if all of a sudden 70% goes on, how is the hospital going to afford, all the expensive and wonderful equipment, that we have grown to rely on?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question we're actually are debating a lot in terms of what will the hospital of the future look like. We know for sure, at least that's a common notion right now, that hospitals of the future will become smaller. It's not that the hospital business would shrink, but the hospitals will become smaller. There wouldn't be a need for all this space. Most of the hospitalizations, as I mentioned before, would be at home. So you won't need the beds, the physical beds in the hospital. You'll need virtual beds in the hospital. We're seeing this trend. There are hospitals in the US that are building virtual facilities. Mercy has built a virtual hospital in St. Louis. We're thinking about building the same here at Sheba Medical Center as well. The idea is that the hospital staff, who are the best trained staff to treat hospitalized patients, will be the one that would cover for patients hospitalized at home. So our doctors and nurses instead of doing rounds in the hospital with actual patients, we'll do rounds in front of a screen where the patients are at home. But it will be the same staff at the hospital who are mostly trained to treat these types of patients. We'll also see surgery move out from the hospital. Much of the surgery will go out to ambulatory surgical centers, and only the most sophisticated surgery will stay at the hospital. So there'll be less need for surgical capacity in the hospital. So hospitals will shrink in the future.
And another follow-up question is, what is the last areas that will be affected or transformed by AI, right? In other words, we're seeing AI march through medicine, almost inexorably. But are there going to be certain kinds of procedures or certain kinds of disciplines which will be the last to fall to the AI juggernaut?
Well, it starts, from my perspective, of course, we're seeing this currently with radiology, we're seeing it with pathology. These are the first to be really highly affected. We're going to see it affect clinical decision-making next. I think in terms of the technological capacity, we're moving towards AI on video. We're doing a lot of work with image processing right now. We're moving towards AI with video. And I think what we're going to be seeing maybe 10 years from now, it could be what you're aiming in terms of your questions. What we're going to see is we're going to see surgical robots layered with AI that will be performing most of the surgery. And I typically, when I talk about this, I compare this to an airline jet that we used to take before COVID, flying from one point to another. And we always talk about the fact that when we fly on an airline jet currently, 95% of the flight, it's autopilot. The pilots typically would take off and maybe land, and that's about it. Everything else is autopilot. This would be surgery 10 years from now. 95% autopilot, maybe 5% human. And that's maybe the last realm of AI we're going to be seeing.
And now a question for David was asked, how far away are we from truly personal drugs, right? In other words, you talk about how your technology with its computational approach and getting away from mice and the long process will allow for precision medicine, which means that I get a different drug than you and other members of this group. How long away are we from that?
It's a great question. To a certain extent, we're already there. There are cell therapies. There's a great Israeli company, Kite Pharma, that came up with a drug that is being developed on the spot for the specific patient. So these technologies exist. The issue with those are the extreme cost and the complexity, the logistical complexity of delivering it to the patient. So to a certain extent, the technologies might reduce it and make those cell therapy, gene therapies a lot more popular solutions. But these technologies, and obviously we're all proud to say that it came from Weizmann Institute here in Israel, these solutions are already in place. To get to the point that it's not only cancers and it's not only the most difficult and deadliest diseases being treated that way, we probably have a long way. But to a certain extent, we can be surprised because breakthroughs like the CAR T technologies came relatively quickly to the clinic, relatively to other technologies, other science fiction technologies like this.
A question for Daniel. Today, there seems to be a proliferation of tests. There are tests for everything. You have to take a different serology test for COVID and a different PCR test, and then you've got rapid breath tests. And it just seems like everyone's got. How are we ever going to get to a universal test, or is that something which simply won't happen? I mean, what will be necessary, and does site diagnostics potentially, because you have this blood and you're analyzing it, hope to get to the ability to do one test, which will see all?
So first of all, as far as the proliferation of tests, one thing we didn't hit on in the segment is the regulatory approval We received the FDA's approval for our CBC test. And one thing that's really important around this vision of a universal test is that you can't skip approving each one of these tests separately. It's very important to demonstrate the quality of each one of these tests separately. Now, running them on the same platform is actually very much part of our vision. Our instrument, Olo, is a pretty universal piece of hardware. It's an advanced programmable microscope with an advanced computer that's built into the box. And when we talked about the additional types of testing that we want to add to the system, we do envision it running on the same test. So either multiple disposable cartridges that you can put in a test, one for one kind of, on the instrument rather, one for one kind of test, another for another kind of test, or down the road, even as you're applying, once you already scanned the blood, why don't you try to extract a number of different diagnostic answers out of it?
Now, thank you. Oren, a question for you about closing the loop with your diagnostic robotics triage, right? In other words, you're essentially doing the sort of the pre-diagnosis, if you will, but not necessarily mitigating completely the need for a doctor in the loop. How far are we from basically, going to your site, using your software, getting diagnosed and getting a prescription and not having to even see a doctor at any point in this cycle?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head with this one. I think the physician is the hardest part of the loop to replace. The physician is the person with the ultimate judgment about what medical treatment the patient should seek, which is why, as a strategy, as a company, we've really focused on the intake portions of the visit. So how you get the patient started, how you get the patient entering into the medical system at the right point, that is where we believe AI has the most impact for value. And as a strategy, what we've started doing is kind of gradually take those initial streamlined routine portions of the visit and see how we can use AI to automate them, to automate the initial portions, the routine visit, the initial questions that we know the physician is going to be asking, the initial procedures they'll be thinking about. And that's kind of the gradual approach we're thinking to embedding AI within medical workflows.
Great. And finally, one last question for our investor, Ellie, on the call. If you had the ability to sort of snap your fingers and conjure up, a VC genie and say, bring me a deal that did the following in AI and medicine that you're not invested in already. Want to share with us what that would look like? Maybe somebody out there will approach you with it.
Only if I get to do the deal with you, John.
That's a deal. That's a deal.
Basically, my strong belief is that the holy grail in healthcare is early detection, right? So the difference between living with a disease for decades and tragically passing on is when you identify it, when you detect it. So to me, it's all about how early can you detect the disease, and then you can leave it to the top practitioners to treat it. And there's no doubt in my mind that the combination of AI and technology will lead to early detection. So anything that can drive towards early detection, better understanding of individual patients, to me is going to sort of be right down the fairway. There's a number of technologies doing that, including on this webinar right now. There's a number of companies sort of focused on that, and we're not constrained by having to pick just one. So we're constrained by our capacity, our time, but we're not constrained, thankfully, by capital. So as far as KDT, as far as Koch's view is concerned, we want to find the best technology companies in the world. In the healthcare space, we're talking about those that can lead to sort of early detection, which enables people to get treated more rapidly, which enables people to live more fulfilling lives.
Wonderfully said. With that, we thank you very much. And I want to thank all of our listeners for your questions and for your patience. I want to thank our panelists for really creating a very exciting set of thoughts and ideas. And my head is spinning, and I look forward to spending more time with you guys very soon. See you on the next OurCrowd webinar. Good night.
think initially what we wanted to do when we looked at platforms globally was how do we get into something that was very, very technology focused, but also had the ability to give our clients the opportunity to look at an end-to-end due diligence process, to trust the veracity of the system, and we picked OurCrowd.
And with OurCrowd, we found a partner who is for us on the ground to really connect us with the relevant companies and the ones which are valuable for us, but also where we as Halma can add value.
Sometimes we're not expert in every field, so the expert opinions available in the platform help us to make the right decisions and save us a lot of time and energy, and so I think it's a wonderful platform.
Before it used to be you had to go to the companies, go to locations, their offices, which is extremely fragmented, but with OurCrowd now it's much more organized and much more streamlined.
We come here every year in order to meet a number of incredible OurCrowd portfolio companies, as well as other innovators in the Israeli tech ecosystem.
It's added a tremendous value to Wave in being a big connector. The network of investors, of other startups, and the speed at which those connections can be turned around happens only in Israel.
OurCrowd exceptionally bring value to the company. We managed to meet amazing people. Many of them became shareholders, investors in the company. They are not only investing money, they're actually working very hard to make sure that we are successful, opening doors, making business development, introductions, sometimes just giving great advice.
What OurCrowd's been able to do very successfully is bring people together that are like-minded and then make the networking effect happen in a much more rapid fashion. And that's valuable to everybody in the industry.